In the first 10 seconds, every human watching the emergency broadcast understood one thing clearly: the universe had given up on them. Stars vanished from the map one by one, evacuation routes lit up in cold blue lines, and a single red wave rolled forward without stopping. Every species was running. Humanity was the only one still standing. The warning did not arrive with drama. There was no thunder, no explosion, no heroic music. It arrived as a quiet system-wide alert, blinking across screens on stations and planets scattered through known space. The message carried no emotion, only fact. The devouring tide has awakened. All civilizations are advised to evacuate immediately. Survival probability through resistance: 0. On Earth, people first thought it was a drill. Traffic slowed. Office buildings paused. Schools stopped mid-lesson. Then the second message arrived, backed by images: dead systems, hollow stars, planets stripped to bone. Panic spread fast, but beneath it something else stirred. Not fear alone. Anger, confusion, and a stubborn refusal to accept what everyone else already had. Far from Earth, aboard the drifting Council Station Aurelian Spire, Ambassador Elena Marr stood motionless as the chamber emptied around her. Species after species disconnected their holograms. Some bowed politely. Some avoided her gaze. A few offered sympathy, the way one might comfort someone already marked for death. The Galactic Concord had voted in less than 3 hours. Evacuation approved. Resistance forbidden. Any species choosing to fight would do so without aid, protection, or recognition. History would not record them as heroes, only as casualties. Elena listened as the final words echoed in the chamber. Survival requires distance, the speaker had said. The tide does not chase. It consumes what remains. What about Earth? Elena had asked. The speaker's many eyes had dimmed slightly. Earth lies directly in the path. There is insufficient time. That was all. Now she stood alone, staring at a star map that no longer showed hope. Earth glowed bright blue at the center of a red corridor. A straight line of destruction leading directly to her home. Elena activated a secure channel. The signal raced across space toward Earth, slower than fear but faster than despair. When the image stabilized, director Samuel Cade appeared on the screen. His hair was unkempt, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp. "They are leaving," Elena said. "All of them." Cade nodded. "We know. We've been watching the departures. They won't help us. They say resistance is pointless." There was a pause. Not silence, Earth was never silent, but a pause in Cade's breathing. When he spoke again, his voice was calm. "Then we won't ask." Elena frowned. "Samuel, they're not exaggerating. The tide has erased thousands of civilizations. They don't fight like we do. They don't negotiate. They don't stop." "Neither do we," Cade replied. "On Earth, governments collapsed and reformed in a single day. Old rivalries were shelved without speeches or treaties. Borders became meaningless when extinction loomed. Militaries merged. Scientists were handed blank checks. Engineers were given impossible deadlines. And ordinary people, teachers, drivers, artists, mechanics, lined up not to flee, but to help. The evacuation numbers were brutal. Even with alien transport assistance, humanity could save less than 1% of its population. 1% chosen by lottery, wealth, or proximity. 1% leaving the rest behind to die. The proposal lasted exactly 11 minutes before it was rejected. Humanity would not choose who lived and who didn't. If the universe was ending for Earth, then Earth would face it together. In the weeks that followed, alien observers watched with quiet disbelief. Instead of dismantling cities, humans fortified them. Instead of packing ships, they converted them. Civilian factories became weapon forges. Mining rigs were turned into kinetic cannons. Power grids were rewired to feed orbital defenses that barely existed a month before. Human technology was crude compared to galactic standards, but it had one advantage: it was fast, messy, and adaptable. Admiral Rhea Calder, newly appointed commander of the United Earth Defense Fleet, stood on the bridge of the carrier Resolute Dawn. Around her floated ships that should not have existed, cargo haulers armored with scrap plating, research vessels bristling with experimental weapons, and old patrol craft retrofitted far beyond their original limits. They were not elegant. They were not impressive. But they were human. "The tide has crossed the outer marker," her tactical officer reported. "Time to Earth, 9 days." 9 days. Across the galaxy, the great evacuation continued. Entire worlds went dark behind retreating fleets. Ancient empires abandoned monuments older than human history. The galaxy folded in on itself, shrinking away from one small, defiant star system. Some alien civilians watched Earth's broadcasts out of morbid curiosity. They expected despair. They expected riots, collapse, prayers to forgotten gods. Instead, they saw children helping assemble drones. They saw old rivals shaking hands. They saw humans laughing in the face of extinction, not because they were brave, but because laughter was one more way to refuse surrender. Elena returned to Earth 3 days before the tide reached the inner systems. She stood in the observation deck above lunar shipyards, watching vessels launch in numbers never seen before. Many would not return. Everyone knew it. "You could have stayed," Cade told her quietly. She shook her head. "If this is the end, I wanted to see it from here." He smiled faintly. "It won't be." The tide did not slow as it approached. Sensor readings confirmed what legends had warned. It was not a fleet, but a living system. Massive biostructures surrounded by clouds of smaller organisms, all moving with unified purpose. It did not scout. It did not hesitate. It simply advanced. As the first human defense lines activated near Mars, alien long-range sensors picked up something unexpected. The tide adjusted its formation, not to avoid the humans, but to analyze them. For the first time in recorded history, the devouring tide encountered a species that had not run. And for the first time, it paused. Humanity did not cheer. There was no celebration. Only silence, heavy and determined. They had made their choice. The galaxy had fled. Humanity chose to fight alone. And this time, the universe was about to learn why that mattered. The silence before the battle was worse than fear. Across the command decks of Earth and its scattered defense platforms, no one spoke unless necessary. Screens glowed with trajectories and probabilities, most of them grim. The devouring tide hovered beyond Mars like a living storm, its vast organic shapes shifting and pulsing as if tasting the system before consuming it. Admiral Rhea Calder stood with her hands clasped behind her back, eyes fixed on the main display. She had fought pirates, insurgents, and rogue fleets. None of that experience truly applied here. This enemy did not think like humans. It did not value victory, territory, or survival. It only consumed. "Signal from the tide," a technician said suddenly, surprise cutting through his discipline. Calder turned sharply. "They don't communicate." "They're not communicating," the technician replied. "They're broadcasting." The feed resolved into raw data, radiation pulses, gravity fluctuations, biological emissions. To most species, it would have been meaningless noise. To human scientists, it was a challenge. "They're scanning us," Dr. Leanne Moravec said from the science pit. "Not just our ships. Our reactions. Our formations. They're learning." Calder allowed herself a thin smile. "Good. Let them." The first human strike was not loud. There were no nuclear flashes, no heroic charge. Instead, a single unmanned probe drifted forward from behind Mars, tumbling slowly, broadcasting a weak distress signal in every known frequency. It looked broken, harmless, forgettable. The tide reacted instantly. A cluster of smaller biovessels detached from the main mass, flowing toward the probe like sharks sensing blood. Alien observers light years away expected the probe to vanish in seconds. It didn't. When the tide vessels came within range, the probe detonated, not with an explosion, but with a localized gravity inversion. Space folded inward. 3 alien craft were crushed into themselves, their organic hulls collapsing like wet paper before vanishing entirely. For half a second, the tide stopped moving. They felt that, Moravec whispered. Calder raised her hand. All batteries. Fire. Mars lit up. Rail cannons thundered silently, hurling tungsten slugs at a fraction of light speed. Missile pods emptied in controlled waves, warheads adjusted mid-flight by AI pilots trained on alien movement patterns only days old. Fighter squadrons surged forward, not in neat lines, but in chaotic, unpredictable arcs. Humanity did not fight with elegance. Humanity fought with refusal. The first true battle of Earth's last stand tore through space above Mars. Alien bioships died screaming in frequencies no human ears could hear, their remains drifting as frozen clouds of organic debris. Human ships died too, burning, breaking, vanishing in flashes of fire and light. But something was wrong. The tide was adapting, but slower than expected. "They're hesitating," a tactical analyst said. "They expected us to break." Calder watched as one of the massive tide constructs took a direct hit from a kinetic barrage. Instead of shrugging it off, the creature ruptured, spilling biomass across space. "They've never fought a species that throws rocks this fast," Calder said quietly. Human weapons were primitive by galactic standards, but they followed one rule perfectly: physics does not care how ancient you are. The tide regrouped, pushing forward with greater density, sacrificing smaller organisms to shield larger ones. It learned fast. Too fast. "Admiral," Moravec said urgently, "they're changing their internal structure. They're reinforcing against kinetic impact." Calder nodded. "Then we change tactics." She opened a fleet-wide channel. Her face appeared on thousands of screens, from hardened warships to barely armored civilian conversions. "All units, listen carefully," she said. "The enemy learns by surviving. So don't let them." Humanity unleashed its second surprise. Hidden among the asteroid belts were thousands of dormant mining charges, devices once used to crack rock for resources. They had been repurposed, reprogrammed, and forgotten by the tide scans. Calder gave the order. The belt detonated. Asteroids shattered, accelerated, and redirected by gravity tethers into a wall of high-velocity debris. It was not a weapon any advanced civilization would have designed. It was inefficient. Wasteful. It was devastating. The tide slammed into the storm of stone and metal, losing hundreds of vessels in seconds. The alien formation broke, fragments scattering as instinct overrode coordination. Across the galaxy, evacuated species watched in stunned silence. This was not how the tide was supposed to behave. "This is impossible," murmured an alien historian on a refugee ark. "They should already be dead." On Earth, no one celebrated. Every victory cost lives. Every second bought with blood. But for the first time since the warning, something spread faster than fear. Hope. Not blind hope. Not optimism. Defiant hope. Hours into the battle, the tide pulled back slightly, reorganizing beyond Mars' orbit. The red wave did not retreat, but it paused. Casualty reports streamed in. Humanity had lost nearly a third of its outer fleet. Some regions of Mars were burning. Defense stations lay in ruins. Yet Earth still stood. Calder closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. "Status." "They're regrouping," the tactical officer said. "But they're wary." Moravec looked up from her console, eyes bright despite exhaustion. "Admiral, we've learned something." Calder turned. "Speak." "The tide is ancient, but it's not creative," Moravec said. "It perfects what works. It doesn't imagine what hasn't happened before." Calder smiled, slow and dangerous. "Then that," she said, "is how we win." Far beyond Mars, deep within the living mass of the devouring tide, signals rippled, confusion, loss, calculation. For the first time in its endless existence, the tide encountered resistance that did not collapse. The galaxy had fled because it believed resistance was meaningless. Humanity resisted because it believed meaning was worth dying for. And the war had only just begun. The galaxy had seen courage before. It had seen warriors charge hopeless battles, civilizations burn themselves out in final, glorious defiance. The devouring tide had consumed them all the same. Courage, the historian said, was loud but short-lived. What the galaxy had never seen was adaptation at human speed. The pause near Mars lasted less than 6 hours, but in that time, humanity changed everything. Inside command bunkers carved deep beneath Earth's surface, scientists worked without sleep. Not because they were ordered to, but because stopping felt impossible. Every scrap of battle data streamed in real time. Every failure was dissected. Every success was copied, twisted, and improved. Dr. Leanne Moravec stood at the center of a projection room, surrounded by rotating models of tide organisms. Her voice was hoarse, but her hands moved with sharp confidence. "They're not ships," she said. "They're ecosystems." Admiral Calder crossed her arms. "Explain." "Their vessels are alive, yes, but more importantly, they're balanced. Every layer exists to support the whole. Armor, propulsion, command nodes, it's all optimized for efficiency and survival in known combat environments." Moravec gestured, highlighting a pulsing structure deep inside a tide capital organism. "But balance," she continued, "is fragile." Calder leaned forward. "You've found a weakness." Moravec nodded. "Not a single weakness. A pattern. When we hit them with unpredictable forces, gravity shifts, kinetic chaos, asymmetrical strikes, their internal systems interfere with each other. They overcorrect." Another scientist stepped in. "They assume the universe behaves logically. We don't." Calder allowed herself a short, sharp laugh. "No," she said. "We really don't." While the tide recalculated, humanity prepared its next move, not by building bigger weapons, but by breaking rules. Civilian hackers were brought into military networks. Not as criminals, but as consultants. Artists were asked how to create visual confusion. Game designers modeled tide behavior like enemy AI in impossible boss fights. Every human discipline mattered. Above Earth, fleets rearranged themselves into formations no formal military doctrine would approve. Ships varied speed randomly. Fighters switched targeting priorities mid-attack. No two engagements followed the same pattern. When the tide advanced again, it met something worse than resistance. It met unpredictability. The second engagement began near the asteroid fields between Mars and Earth. This time, humanity didn't wait. Human ships surged forward aggressively, darting in and out of range, firing weapons that didn't always aim to destroy. Some targeted propulsion. Some targeted sensory nodes. Some did nothing but emit noise, radio static, old television signals, even fragments of music. "Are we really blasting ancient monsters with rock songs?" a pilot asked over comms. "Yes," his commander replied. "And it's working." The tide reacted violently. Its organisms twisted, realigning defenses, but every adjustment created a new vulnerability somewhere else. When one section hardened against kinetic impact, another became sensitive to radiation. When command nodes centralized, they became targets. Humanity watched, learned, adjusted again. Alien refugees observing from afar felt unease creep into their collective consciousness. This was not a doomed last stand. This was a fight. On one distant arc, Ambassador Tvarek of the Solari Collective stared at the feeds in disbelief. His people had fled 3 generations ago when the tide first appeared. "They shouldn't be able to do this," he whispered. A younger Solari beside him spoke hesitantly. "Ambassador, the humans are enjoying it." It was true. Not enjoying the death, or the loss, but the challenge. The problem-solving. The refusal to accept the universe's verdict. For humans, impossibility had always been an invitation. Back on Earth, cities lived under constant alert. The sky was no longer empty. Bright streaks crossed the atmosphere daily as debris burned up. People slept in shelters, worked in shifts, and watched the stars like they were watching a storm that might finally pass. Yet something strange happened. Crime dropped to near zero. Arguments felt small. Strangers helped one another without hesitation. Humanity, facing extinction, became more itself than it had ever been. Elena Ma walked through a hospital in Nairobi, watching volunteers tend to wounded pilots flown in from orbit. No one asked if it was worth it anymore. The question had changed. Not can we survive, but how far can we push them before they break? The answer came sooner than expected. During the third major clash, Tide forces attempted a direct penetration toward Earth, abandoning layered formations in favor of brute mass. It should have worked. Instead, they triggered humanity's final surprise of the phase. A weapon without a name. Human engineers had taken a concept once dismissed as impractical, localized space-time shear, and made it ugly, unstable, and effective. The device did not destroy matter. It separated it. When activated, sections of the Tide fleet simply came apart. Not exploded. Not burned. Their molecular bonds failed for fractions of a second, enough to turn living warships into drifting clouds. The Tide screamed. Not in sound, but in signal. Across every band, a sudden spike erupted. Confusion, alarm, something close to pain. Moravec stared at the data, hands trembling. They didn't know this was possible. Calder straightened slowly. Now they do. For the first time since it awakened, the devouring Tide did something no record had ever shown. It retreated. Not far. Not in panic. But deliberately. Alien observers froze in disbelief. Emergency councils reconvened in exile. Messages flooded dark channels. The Tide has paused. The Tide is reconsidering. The humans are still alive. Humanity had not won. But it had done the unthinkable. It had forced an ancient, unstoppable force of the universe to stop and think. And that terrified the galaxy more than any victory ever could. The devouring Tide did not flee. It withdrew, slowly and deliberately, pulling its wounded mass into a tighter formation beyond Earth's outer defense perimeter. To the galaxy, that single action sent shockwaves deeper than any explosion. Because the Tide had never withdrawn before. Across refugee fleets scattered near the galactic rim, alarms sounded, not of danger, but of disbelief. Observers replayed the footage again and again, searching for errors. Ancient records were reopened. Historians argued. Military analysts whispered a word none of them had dared to use. Hope. Ambassador Tvarek stood before a hastily assembled council of exiles aboard a massive Solari Ark. His crystalline form flickered with agitation as the human battle footage played behind him. They did not break, he said. They adapted faster than the Tide. A taller figure interrupted him. Temporary success, growled a Korati warlord. The Tide always returns stronger. Yes, Tvarek replied, but never cautious. That word settled heavily over the chamber. Caution meant fear. Fear meant the universe was no longer predictable. Back in the Sol system, humanity paid dearly for every second of that pause. Damaged ships drifted powerless. Rescue crews worked non-stop, pulling survivors from vacuum and fire. Names were read aloud across the planet, not as propaganda, but as remembrance. Admiral Rhea Calder watched the casualty list scroll past her display. She did not look away. They bought us time, she said quietly. We don't waste it. In underground research hubs and orbital labs, humanity pushed beyond safety. Experimental systems were tested live. Some failed catastrophically. Others changed the rules entirely. Dr. Moravec addressed a room full of exhausted engineers. The Tide learns through survival, she said. So we must teach it the wrong lessons. She explained the plan simply. Humanity would stop trying to destroy the Tide outright. Instead, they would confuse it. The next wave of human attacks did not target command nodes or propulsion. They targeted patterns. Human ships attacked, then deliberately fled. They left wreckage seeded with false data. They transmitted misleading signals, simulated panic, simulated retreat, simulated weakness. To the Tide, it looked like victory. And the Tide followed. Leading its forces into regions of space prepared weeks in advance. Zones saturated with sensor ghosts, gravity traps, and weaponized debris fields that made no logical sense. The Tide lost ships again. But more importantly, it lost certainty. Inside the living core of the devouring Tide, something unprecedented occurred. Neural clusters, once synchronized across millions of organisms, began diverging. Different strategies competed. Efficiency fractured. The tide was not just fighting humans. It was arguing with itself. Moravec realized it first when she saw the data. "They're hesitating internally," she said, voice shaking. "They're no longer unified." Calder looked up sharply. "Say that again." "They're ancient," Moravec continued. "Too ancient. They've optimized themselves into rigidity. We're forcing them into decisions they were never built to make." Calder exhaled slowly. "Then we push harder." As the fighting intensified, something unexpected happened. Alien ships returned. Not fleets. Not armies. Observers. Small, unarmed vessels lingered at the edge of the Sol system, watching from afar. Some transmitted quiet data requests. Others simply listened. They were the ones who had fled first. They were watching humanity refuse to die. Elena Ma received one such transmission while standing in the Earth Defense Coordination Center. "This is Ambassador Tvarek," the message said. "On behalf of the Solari, we were wrong." She closed her eyes. "We believed survival meant distance," the alien continued. "You have shown us survival may require resistance. If we return, will you accept us?" Elena did not hesitate. "We never closed the door," she replied. "But understand this, we don't fight for you. We fight with you." The response came moments later. "Understood." One by one, ships emerged from faster-than-light transit near the edge of the system. Not enough to turn the tide of war, but enough to change its meaning. The galaxy was coming back. The devouring tide noticed. Sensors within the alien mass detected new variables, new species, new tactics, new chaos. The enemy it faced was no longer a single, defiant world. It was becoming a coalition. The tide reacted as it always had. It escalated. Deep within its formation, massive structures awakened, entities larger than anything yet seen. Planet killers. Living weapons designed to end resistance permanently. Admiral Calder watched the projections form. "That's it," she said. "They're done testing us." Earth trembled as emergency sirens sounded worldwide. The final phase was coming. Humanity had forced the galaxy to look back. Now, together or alone, they would find out whether standing your ground could truly change the fate of the universe. The devouring tide advanced with purpose. No more probing attacks. No hesitation. No learning through caution. The massive living structures at the heart of the swarm awakened fully, unfolding like ancient gods stretching after a long sleep. Each one was larger than a city, layered in armor grown over millions of years, powered by biological systems that had ended entire eras of life across the galaxy. This was the tide's final answer. Across Earth, people felt it before they saw it. Gravity fluctuated. Tides shifted. The planet itself seemed to brace, as if it understood what was coming. Admiral Rear Calder stood on the bridge of the Resolute Dawn, watching the projections form. Her fleet was battered. Reinforced by a handful of returning alien ships, yes, but still hopelessly outmatched. A junior officer swallowed hard. "Admiral, we can't stop that." Calder nodded. "I know." She opened a channel, not just to the fleet, but to Earth. Every screen lit up. Shelters. Homes. Hospitals. Factories. Cities in ruins and cities still standing. "This is Admiral Calder," she said. Her voice was steady, not loud. "You know what's coming. I won't lie to you and say we're safe. We aren't." People listened. Not in fear, but in silence. The galaxy believed survival meant running. They believed life was something to be protected by distance. Humans, we learned something different. The tide closed in, vast shadows eclipsing the stars. We learned that life is protected by standing together. She paused, then smiled faintly. And by being very, very stubborn. The final human plan activated. It was not a superweapon. It was worse. Hidden throughout the Sol system were thousands of small devices, nothing impressive alone. Power regulators, gravity anchors, space-time stabilizers once designed for deep space construction. Individually harmless. Together, they formed a net. As the tide's largest entities crossed the threshold, the net activated. Space resisted. Not violently. Not explosively. Reality itself became difficult. The tide's massive organisms slowed. Their internal systems, evolved for a universe that behaved predictably, struggled against distorted physics. Energy transfers misfired. Coordination lagged. "They're stuck," Moravec whispered, watching the data stream in disbelief. Not trapped. Just unable to move efficiently. Calder's eyes hardened. All forces. Now. Human ships surged forward for the last time. They didn't aim to destroy the giants. They aimed to infect them. Human drones, simple, fast, disposable, pierced damaged sections and released tailored data viruses, disruptive electromagnetic pulses, and chaotic signal feedback. Not weapons meant to kill. Weapons meant to confuse. The tide's neural networks fractured under the strain. Commands contradicted themselves. Defensive adaptations interfered with propulsion. The giants began colliding with their own escorts. Then something happened that no record had ever shown. The devouring tide panicked. Across every frequency, a raw transmission burst outward, untranslate, unfiltered. Alien linguists froze as meaning resolved. The signal was not a threat. It was not rage. It was uncertainty. The tide had encountered something it could not optimize against. A species that did not seek perfect survival. A species that accepted loss, pain, and chaos, and kept fighting anyway. Inside one of the massive organisms, systems overloaded. The space-time net amplified the failure. The giant collapsed inward, not exploding, but folding into itself until it vanished completely. The first true death of a core tide entity. Silence followed. Then the tide broke. Not in disorder, but in retreat. The living mass turned away from Earth, withdrawing at full acceleration. Not regrouping. Not repositioning. Leaving. Across the Sol system, sensors confirmed it. The devouring tide was abandoning its advance. On Earth, people didn't cheer at first. They watched in disbelief as the red warning markers faded from the sky. As gravity stabilized. As the stars returned to their familiar positions. Then someone laughed. Someone cried. Someone else simply sat down and breathed for the first time in months. Admiral Calder closed her eyes. When she opened them, tears floated free in the low gravity of the bridge. "We did it," someone whispered. "No," Calder said softly. "We survived." Across the galaxy, the shock was immediate. Messages poured in. From species that had fled. From empires that had abandoned entire sectors. From historians rewriting everything they thought they knew. Humanity had not destroyed the devouring tide. Humanity had changed it. The tide would return someday. Everyone knew that. But now it would remember. It would remember the species that did not run. The species that fought without certainty. The species that turned creativity, chaos, and cooperation into weapons. Ambassador Elena Marr stood beneath an open sky in Geneva, watching alien ships descend peacefully for the first time. Beside her, representatives from worlds that once pitted humanity now stood in quiet respect. "What will you do now?" one asked. Elena smiled. "What we've always done," she said. "Build. Argue. Improve. Prepare." The universe had learned a lesson it would never forget. When every species ran from the invasion, humanity chose to fight alone. And the galaxy would never underestimate them again.